Welcome to the Sports Trading Card Hall of Fame. Today I'm going to be talking about one of the most important athletes in the history of sports cards. Now, this fits into an unusual corner of the conversation of influences into sports cards, because I'm going to be talking about one of the most important athletes in terms of moving a sport into the limelight and putting it up at another level. But the importance that he has is difficult to measure, because when you talk about an athlete who is bigger than the sport and carries the sport up, the first athlete that we think of is Michael Jordan, and with very good reason. The problem is that with Mike, well, he is equally important as David Stern. David Stern had been building the NBA up for years, not always through the cleanest of movements, but Stern knew how to take advantage of great opportunities and market the crap out of it, and Jordan became the next pawn that he was able to use, and he knew how to fully utilize that, especially when the Dream Team came up, and he knew how to blend all of that together. The Dream Team was mostly about bringing the NBA into that next level, whereas the 1992 Olympics was really about foreign basketball players and being able to respect them for what they were in a way that we had never been able to appreciate. So when you talk about the evolution of the NBA, the drafting of Patrick Ewing by the Knicks, how in the world did that happen? The promotion of the Celtics and the Lakers, the handing the torch over to Michael Jordan, you had the Olympics, you had all of these steps moving along. David Robinson was a big part of it, and then the Lakers as we moved into the new millennium. David Stern knew how to sit down and take the sport, and he was able to figure out how to connect with the next audience and build the sport the way that it needed to move, the way that it would naturally move, and to position it just right. He's sorely missed by the league right now, for sure. But Michael Jordan did not individually carry the league. It's just that Jordan was so much better than everybody else that he was like the cheat code. And so, yes, Michael Jordan is the reason that the league moved to that higher level, but it was already making that progress. He just leaped it at a faster rate than anybody else, and he had a bigger impact than any other basketball player ever did or probably ever will have. So in terms of carrying the league, he gets half credit for that. But if you really want to see somebody who carried a league and took the league to a level that, because he was so big, he could bring the league to places the league couldn't access, you really look at Babe Ruth. Because Babe Ruth was big in the 1920s, 1930s, but he was like a Paul Bunyan figure. He was mythical, and his name traveled to places that baseball couldn't, because baseball was still very small and very regional. We talk about it as America's sport, and yes, everybody played baseball, but Major League Baseball wasn't a national conversation, because in the 1920s and 1930s it was very difficult to travel across the country. News was rare, and even with that, you had teams in St. Louis and Chicago. But outside of that, in the farming communities, they didn't even necessarily know that there was a team local to them, like a day's drive away, because the way that news traveled and the priorities just weren't naturally set up to allow something like a national sport to really carry all the way down to the average person. And so Babe Ruth was able to use his mystique, which was so much bigger than the sport, like I said. And he did a famous whistle stop tour, he was famous for doing whistle stop tours where he would travel around to places that the league wasn't. And he could bring the good news of baseball and proselytize it to the entire nation, or at least the nation out in the Midwest and on the East Coast. So he brought baseball from the centers where it was known out into the outskirts. But still, baseball was tucked up in the corner. It wasn't a national presence. And while Babe Ruth was able to bring I should say, I described Babe Ruth as the Paul Bunyan. I should really say he was more the Johnny Appleseed, because that's what he did. He propagated the sport across more and more of the country and made it more of a universal conversation, and by nature, the New York Yankees specifically. So he was able to do that, which really helped to build the sport, but it didn't quite turn it into a national sport because how do you get the West Coast to care? The West Coast had their own league, not at the same level, but they had their own league, and that was their own focus. So while Babe Ruth was able to help Major League Baseball significantly, there was one person who was actually even bigger in his own sport, which was Red Grange, because he went from college football to the NFL and was able to give the NFL validity. So, like I said, baseball was a national sport, but Major League Baseball was not a national sport, whereas college football was. And that's because you couldn't necessarily travel. I mean, even the St. Louis Cardinals couldn't travel out to the West Coast. It would take, it was just too much work to be able to do that. So there was a very clear divide. And so Major League Baseball itself just didn't exist on the West Coast because you had the Great Plains and the Rockies and Nevada and all of that in the way. College football was different because there were colleges everywhere. You had Stanford, you had Northwestern, you had Yale, you had Rutgers, and you had Alabama. You had all these major colleges all over the place. And football was something very natural to colleges, but it was also competitive in a different level because it was more personal. And so when you have a college team travel into the stadium of another college, it's almost like they're invading, which is kind of what football is all about. The reason that we have conferences in college football is not the same as divisions in other sports. You have conferences because that was the entire competitive space. So you had a conference in the Pacific Coast, you had a conference in the Midwest, you had a conference in the Northeast, you had it in the Southeast. You had these areas so that you could actually travel between the colleges meaningfully, and they had their bowls, but they didn't compete conference to conference to conference because it was too hard to travel there. So you knew all of all the teams in your conference, but you knew about colleges in other parts of the country because college football had its own level of professionalism that regional baseball didn't quite have. So that means that if you lived on, say, the West Coast, you knew about Notre Dame, Army, Navy, Yale. You knew about these major colleges, the legendary players that were in these colleges, because they had that Paul Bunyan-like mystique. But you related to the sport. And so you had all of your teams, and then there were these players who were so much bigger, whether it was the Four Horsemen or whoever, all of these legendary players, you would hear about them. And Red Grange was one of those players. So when the Chicago Bears hired him to be a member of their team, now they had somebody who had a name recognition that people outside of the region where the NFL was at, they knew this guy, they recognized him. And so as they did their own whistle stop tour, they were doing it not to show people the Chicago Bears, but for people to come out and see Red Grange. So Babe Ruth was doing a whistle stop tour so that people could see Babe Ruth himself, and then they got to play baseball with him, and it made it more personal. The NFL was doing, or the Chicago Bears were doing the exact same thing with Red Grange, where people were coming to see Red Grange, and they got to see the other Chicago Bears as well. And this allowed for the NFL to get a whole different kind of footprint, but it also gave them the ability to be recognizable from coast to coast. So these individual players brought the league to another level in different ways. But the idea that somebody would be so big that they could carry the whole league to another level is really difficult to find an example, because we love to talk about how everybody knew who Wayne Gretzky was, and that's fine, but he didn't make the game more popular. Everybody knew who Pele was, but he didn't make the game of soccer more popular. Everybody knew who, Richard Petty was, didn't make NASCAR more popular. Or Mario Andretti didn't make open wheel racing more popular. These are just the guys that everybody knew. But to actually bring in new audiences and really fill out The stands, or in the case of what we're going to talk about, the gallery, that's very, very rare. That's something that was possible with Red Grange, possible with Babe Ruth. With Michael Jordan, possibly. But Tiger Woods definitely fit that. Now, here's the difference. When Tiger Woods left, the numbers in golf dropped back down. And that's the reason I can't quite put him at the same level as Babe Ruth and Red Grange, as much as I'd like to. Because when Tiger Woods joined the tour in the late 1990s, he was somebody who was, he was basically a prodigy. In the 1980s, for crying out loud, he was on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson as a little kid. So he was groomed to become a success, and that's part of where his talent came from. But even at that, when he was out there golfing, he just had a different presence. And that presence was important for golf, because golf is not a sport that is designed for personality. If you think about it, every sport is about conflict. It's about personalities going one-on-one. Golf is about respect. It's about restraint. It's about quiet. It's about making sure you don't disturb your opponent. You want your opponent to have all the advantages possible to do their job the best they can. Name another sport that does that. No other sport does. Okay, maybe curling, maybe bowling, but outside of that, no, it's about intimidation. It's about conquest. It's about conflict. Golf is about getting away from that. Quiet, do not disturb. So in tennis was a more universally popular sport because in the 70s and the 80s, you had, John McEnroe, Martina Navratilova, Chris Evert. You had these really big personalities. And then heading into the 90s, you had Andre Agassi and Pete Sampras. I mean, really, it was an exciting space because that's the way the sport was. It was about personality. It was about aggression and emotion. Great to watch. But tennis doesn't have the community that golf does. Golf is very different where, okay, name a tennis shop. Odds are you can it's probably not too hard to find a golf shop, but a tennis shop, not so much. There's a golf community. And there are places where golf fans and golfers come and collect and spend time. And so it's a sport where you actually have a home base of some sort. So it actually is easier to be a star in golf because of the enduring relationship you have with your audience, whereas with tennis, it's a lot more ephemeral. And that's the reason why there were never tennis cards made, but there were golf cards. But it's difficult to make golf cards work because even though you have a solid audience that's ready to buy stuff, who wants to buy cards about golf? It doesn't quite fit. And two companies did try. Don Russ tried in 1981, tried for 2 years, didn't work. Pro Set did, starting in 1990. They made 3 sets, and then Pro Set itself fell apart. So unfortunately, neither company could really make it work because, again, it's not a natural combination. Golf isn't the kind of thing that kids sit around eating cereal in the morning dreaming about. It's not that kind of a combination. So cards didn't really make sense. The kinds of players who kids would be into would be over in tennis, but again, that's not the kind of sport that really is conducive for the stability of something like sports cards. Tiger Woods came in and he brought that energy that tennis had. It was incredible what he was able to bring. I mean, he had emotion, he had fire, passion. It was all on display. And it wasn't like some dumb Adam Sandler movie. I mean, this actually fit with golf. And he brought energy to the sport in a way that, okay, there's one other person I can think of who brought a similar amount of energy to their sport, which is Lance Armstrong. I mean, for some reason, all of a sudden people became cycling fans for a couple of years. It was really unusual to see. And then when Lance Armstrong was no longer, shall we say, appreciated, no longer was cycling appreciated, just disappeared again. Golf, I think, held up a little bit better, but golf already had a community. And so when Tiger Woods was no longer inspiring new people, golf settled back down into a similar rhythm. It's just we were more used to golf at that point. But In the 1990s, golf itself, it was easier for you to understand about golf if you were near a golf course. Like for me, I grew up near Rancho Murrieta, and so Chichi Rodriguez was a popular person there because we saw him there all the time. He was on ads all the time. It was this big thing. But if you weren't around a golf course, you didn't get that kind of exposure. So people knew who Jack Sneed had been. They knew who Arnold Palmer was. They knew who Jack Nicklaus was. They knew who Payne Stewart was, and probably who Greg Norman was. There were names that we knew, but there wasn't a lot of, they didn't pull people in. Arnold Palmer and Jack Nicklaus kind of did, because they had a fiery quality to them that did connect with people who weren't naturally golf fans. But outside of that, there just wasn't much else in golf. And so what Tiger Woods did was he wasn't just somebody who won everything. Because look, Jeff Gordon won everything too. But he didn't pull people into NASCAR. Just like Richard Petty didn't pull people into NASCAR, and Dale Earnhardt didn't pull people into NASCAR. They strengthened their numbers, but they didn't broaden the sport too much. Tiger Woods was at a different level. He was winning, but he was just all excitement, and he was new. He was fresh and new. There was something about him that was so magnetizing that literally people who didn't care anything about golf, and wouldn't in a couple of decades, were pulling themselves in. It was so big that by the new millennium, Upper Deck needed to make cards. There was too much potential for this. Now, there had been, like I said, golf cards in the past, and soccer cards, and there had been a number of attempts at other sports that just didn't resonate, but the Tiger Mania was so big that these cards were absolutely going to sell. So Upper Deck went ahead and made a couple of card sets. They did Upper Deck and they did SP. And they even got Beckett to do magazines for golf to try to build this audience. They needed to do this. And when you look at the early golf sets in 2001, 02, into 03, it was mostly about Tiger Woods. Annika Sorenstam did start to fill out that sport, or that space as well, on the women's side, because she was so big and people were now actually knowing who she was, but it was all because of Tiger Woods. And Tiger was so big that the legendary Phil Mickelson is hardly even respected as a golfer to the level that he otherwise would, because he was in the shadow of Tiger Woods. So the power that he had was so much that he made a corner of the industry of sports cards. And it carried for a couple of years, and then it just kind of waned. But golf cards would come back every once in a while, so it's not like they disappeared. But that's the kind of power that he had, that he would not only elevate a sport, but he would create a viable market in sports cards for something that there otherwise would never be a viable market for. Because again, there weren't any tennis cards. Soccer cards basically didn't exist until really pretty recently. Only golf cards had a really strong presence outside of the traditional sports of baseball, football, basketball, hockey, and NASCAR. NASCAR is a really big area for sports cards as well. And then there's golf. And again, not so much because of the 80s and 90s cards, but really the early 2000s cards. Those are the ones that really made a big impact. And that small industry was able to be carried by an individual. Not often that an individual has that kind of power, or that kind of influence, but Tiger Woods most certainly did. So that's what I wanted to do in talking about this story of cardboard, specifically about Tiger Woods. Yeah, it's really interesting part of the hobby because of how unusual it is. And if you look at the few sets that were created during that little bubble of time, it is pretty surreal to see, but it helps you to see just how big he was if you didn't have the opportunity to experience it. I do wish that the cards could have held on longer with more energy, but golf cards are difficult, and it was really more about a fad. So, that's how it was. But it was really interesting. If you have any stories about Tiger Woods or about sports cards, please by all means let me know in the comments down below. I'm going to be doing more stories of cardboard over the course of this month, so certainly look for those. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. Thank you very much for watching.